Sam's car rattled along the long, winding road to Hollows Creek, the dense woods pressing in on both sides. He'd been running away from a broken marriage, a failed career, and the haunting whispers of his own regrets. Hollows Creek, a town forgotten by time, seemed like the perfect place to vanish. But as the car pulled into the town square, something didn't feel right. The houses were too pristine, the air too still. The people who passed by barely seemed to breathe, too quiet, too watchful. It was as though the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. An old woman, frail and bent with age, stepped out of the shadows. She gave him a long, drawn-out stare, her eyes hollow. "Don't stay after dusk, boy," she muttered before retreating into a crumbling shack. The words left a chill in Sam's gut, but he shook it off. He was here to forget, to start fresh. Surely, he thought, this was just a small-town superstition. As the sun sank low in the sky, the town square came alive with an unsettling energy. The harvest festival had begun. Long tables covered in blood-red tablecloths stretched into the night, piled high with food. The townsfolk moved about like moths to a flame, their smiles wide, their eyes glazed with a kind of fervor. A man, tall and gaunt, approached Sam with a glass of dark, thick wine. His smile was too perfect, his teeth too white. "Drink, my friend," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "Our town's offering will bring you peace." Sam hesitated, but the pressure to fit in overpowered his unease. He took the glass and sipped. The wine tasted strange, metallic, like blood. As he swallowed, an overwhelming dizziness flooded his mind, and the world tilted around him. The sounds of laughter grew louder, more intense, as though something was clawing at the edges of his consciousness. "Eat," the man urged, his grin never faltering. Sam looked down at his plate. The meat was a deep, bloody red, still oozing as if it had just been carved from a live animal. It shimmered with an unnatural sheen. As he lifted the fork to his mouth, a distant scream echoed in his mind, but he ignored it and took the first bite. The meat was tender, its flavor rich and complex, too complex. And then it hit him. It wasn't just the wine that was wrong. The meat tasted familiar, but that couldn't be right. Suddenly, a child sitting across the table giggled. "It's just like last year's offering. You'll be just like them." She laughed again, her face twisted with gleeful malice. The laughter of the others drowned out Sam's rising panic. His heart raced, his stomach revolting. The meat in his mouth began to move, wriggling like it was alive. A scream built up in his throat, but he choked it back, his body too weak to fight the compulsion to eat. That night he staggered to his feet, his body trembling with a mixture of nausea and terror. His vision was blurry, his thoughts clouded, but the gnawing realization clawed at him. He had eaten human flesh. As he lurched through the darkened streets, he stumbled upon the town's most sacred place, the altar. The stone slab was slick with fresh blood, glowing faintly under the moon's light. Around it stood the town's elders, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, their faces twisted with joy. "We were waiting for you," the tall man from earlier said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. "You're the offering this year. We've been feeding the land with your kind, bringing it new life for generations. The harvests, the wealth, it all comes from you." Sam stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell are you talking about? No, I don't. You don't get it, do you?" The elder smiled, stepping forward. His teeth were sharp, blood-stained. "Every year one outsider is chosen. We feed you, we break you. And in return the land thrives. The crops, the livestock, they grow fat and plentiful on your blood." The ground beneath Sam's feet seemed to shift. The moonlight gleamed on the altar and he saw something moving, a body, twisted, bent at unnatural angles. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. They weren't just eating him. They were turning him into the next sacrifice. Before Sam could scream, they descended on him, grabbing him by the arms and dragging him to the altar. A sharp, agonizing pain shot through his spine as they cut into his flesh, carving runes and symbols that burned like fire. He tried to fight, but his limbs were paralyzed by the wine. his body too weak to resist. He felt his skin tear, felt the warm blood flow, but it didn't feel real. It was like a nightmare, like he was already slipping away. Through blurred vision, he saw Mara, the woman who had warned him, but her eyes were vacant now, empty. She was part of this ritual, just like the others, trapped forever, bound to the land by the same curse. The final moment came when they plunged the blade into his chest, severing his heart. His scream died in his throat as his life drained away, leaving only emptiness behind. The blood pooled on the altar, and as it sank into the earth, the crops began to glow. The crops in Hollows Creek had grown unnaturally large, vibrantly colored vegetables that seemed almost too perfect, glistening under the fall sun. But no one questioned it. The townsfolk were content, their eyes glazed with satisfaction, knowing they had survived another year. Emma, the new visitor, wandered through the town, marveling at the lush fields. She had arrived just as the festival preparations began, unaware of the dark rituals lurking beneath the surface. But as she walked through the town square, a shiver crawled up her spine. There was something about the way the people watched her, too eager, too expectant. Mara, now a part of the town's spirit-bound collection, approached her from the shadows. "You don't want to stay here," she whispered, her voice almost drowned by the wind. "You're the one they want." Emma recoiled. What? What are you talking about?" "You've been chosen," Mara continued, her hollow eyes fixated on her. "Just like them, just like me, just like Sam. There's no escaping it once you've set foot in this town. They will feed on you." Before Emma could respond, the townsfolk descended upon her, their smiles widening in sickening delight. They grabbed her, forcing her toward the barn where the feast would begin. She struggled against their grip, but it was as though their hands had been made of iron, unyielding and cold. In the barn, Emma was chained to the altar, her heart racing as the townsfolk gathered around her. They hummed in eerie unison, chanting words she couldn't understand. A tall figure emerged from the crowd, the elder from last year's harvest. "We welcome you," he said, his voice echoing around her, to the tradition of Hollows Creek. "You will be the harvest, and in return, the land will offer prosperity to us all." Emma's stomach twisted. "What the hell are you talking about? You can't do this to me." The elder grinned. "Oh, but we can. You see, it's not just you we feast on. The land itself feeds on you, on your essence, your soul. You become part of it, and in return the town survives." The townsfolk encircled her, their eyes glistening with hunger. As the ritual began, the blood was spilled, and the air grew thick with the stench of death. Emma screamed, the pain unbearable as the ritual knife carved into her skin. Her vision blurred, her body fading under the relentless assault. But then, just as she felt the pull of darkness, something strange happened. As Emma's life slipped away, a strange sensation washed over her. A voice, deep and ancient, whispered in her mind, "This is not your end, Emma. Not yet." Suddenly, the altar beneath her began to crack, the stone splitting down the middle. The ground trembled and the town square seemed to warp, the air thickening with a force far beyond what Emma had ever imagined. The elder's face twisted in confusion, his confident grin faltering. "What's happening?" The ground split open beneath him and a dark, viscous liquid began to pour from the cracks. The townsfolk gasped as they backed away, their eyes wide with fear. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy as something far older than the ritual itself began to awaken. Chapter 8. The True Harvest. From the rift a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in shadows, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. Its presence was suffocating, filling the space with a cold that no living thing could endure. The elder fell to his knees. "No, it can't be. You shouldn't be free." The figure's voice boomed, low and guttural, vibrating the very bones of the earth. "You fools! You think you control me? You think you control the harvest?" The ground beneath the townsfolk began to shift violently. One by one, they screamed as their bodies started to decay, their flesh tearing apart in gruesome bursts. Their screams filled the air, rising to a deafening pitch as they disintegrated into dust. The harvest wasn't just about the crops. It was about feeding something much darker, something that had been dormant for centuries. Emma, still chained to the altar, watched in horror as the townspeople were consumed by the darkness. The figure turned to her, its voice now a whisper in her mind. "You were the catalyst, Emma, the key to unlocking what was always meant to be." She could feel herself being pulled into the void, her body shaking with terror. But then, in a flash of clarity, she understood. This wasn't just a harvest of crops. It wasn't just about feeding the land. This was a harvest of souls. Chapter 9. The Return. The townsfolk were gone, nothing but dust and broken dreams scattered on the wind. The dark figure turned its attention to Emma, its eyes glowing with an ancient hunger. "Now it is your turn," the voice whispered. "You will join us forever as we awaken and reclaim what was once ours." Emma screamed, her body convulsing as she felt the life drain from her. The figure's hands reached out to claim her, its touch cold as death itself. But just as it touched her, the world around her shattered. The air thickened, the earth quaked, and the light from the rift vanished, leaving only silence. Emma's body crumpled to the ground, her eyes wide with terror. She was alive, but not alive. Trapped in some in-between state where her soul was no longer her own. And in the distance, deep in the forest, the whispers began again. The harvest would return. Chapter 10. The Return of the Harvest. The next year, the townsfolk of Hollows Creek returned, reborn, but not quite human. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their skin was stretched thin, as though the harvest had taken something vital from them. They stood in silence, waiting, watching, and in the center of the town square, under the dead trees where the altar once stood, a new visitor arrived. This time it was a young man named Ben, looking for a fresh start. As he entered the square, the townsfolk's eyes locked onto him. A soft whisper spread through the crowd. It was time for another harvest. But in the distance, from the shadowed woods, a figure watched silently. Emma, no longer just a memory, no longer just a victim. Her hollow eyes followed Ben as he entered the square, her hand slowly lifting, beckoning him toward the altar. Ben had no idea what awaited him, but he would soon learn.